Hello. We are doing the rest of chapter 14. Um, I'm wondering if I make movement, maybe YouTube will catch time where I'm not going like that. Someone told me that they have a program that just looks for movement, and then they pick three of those and they put it as the beginning or the introduction piece, and they're always awful. Anyway, I guess I'll figure it out one of these days. So we're with YouTube. As I've said, I give this class to women on Zoom. Uh, of course, everyone knows right now that we're been in quarantine, and we're encouraged to get around as little as possible. So we started a Bible study on Zoom, and I record it on YouTube later, so you won't be able to hear any of the comments the women make in case we're talking about prayer requests or something else. So this is why I do it a second time on YouTube. Speed it up. I think it's easier to listen to. Even podcasts are easier if you speed up the sound a little bit. Okay, so I hope you looked at the rest of chapter 14. We're going to start in verse 23. This is when Jesus took the bread and took the wine, and in Passover, which we talked about last time, there are 4 cups of wine, and he took, I believe, the third one, which is the cup of redemption, and he started communion with, "This is my body." He broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, "This is my body." Then he took the wine, gave thanks, and gave it, and they all drank from it. And this is the blood that brought our redemption. So God always needs blood for his covenants. In the Old Testament, the covenant was based on the law, which people could not ever fulfill. They were always in default. And in the new covenant, it's based on God's love. And God provided the way for us to be able, through the Holy Spirit and the sacrifice of Jesus, to be a part of the new covenant. Then they sang a song and they went to the Mount of Olives. The hymn that they traditionally sing is Psalm 136. So sometime look at that, and they would sing that as they'd go. I think it's amazing to think, I don't know if I mentioned it before, but there's a group of Psalms that are called Psalms of Ascent. And because Jerusalem was up high, people would have to walk up to Jerusalem and get there. So they had different psalms that they would sing as they walked up the mount in order to get into the city. So I thought, it must be glorious to be there and hear people singing hymns and songs to the Lord as they get into Jerusalem. And even here, where after Passover, they sang Psalm 136. And then Jesus told them, we're in verse 27, "You will all fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered." Of course, we've talked at length about the disciples not fully understanding what was happening and who could blame them. And again, they probably are looking at Jesus, knowing that something is up, because it's been on his mind ever since they turned towards Jerusalem this final time. And so he's talking about it. He talked about it during Passover, and here he is talking about it once again. And so they are getting ready to leave the city and go to Mount Olive. And he said, after I've risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. And this was very important for the disciples to hear because, of course, they are in Judea, which is the southern part of Israel, and they needed to go back up to Galilee, where most of them were from, except for a few. And Peter declared, I'll never fall away from you. Of course, it was Peter that said what everybody else was thinking. Truly, I tell you, Jesus answered him, today, yes, even tonight, before the rooster crows, twice, you will disown me 3 times. Now, the rooster crowing twice, many times it would wake up a little early before dawn and give a few crows. But then it would either settle down, go back to sleep, or just wait until it could see first light, and then it would crow again. So this would be about 3 o'clock, between 3 and 6 o'clock. And everybody knew that. But Peter insisted emphatically, even if I have to die, I will never disown you. And all the others said the same. Now, one thing about Peter, we have to admit, is he was, I always say lovingly, he was ADD, having raised one myself, and very active, tend to say what they think without thinking, and will do things on a whim or without thinking. Yeah, the stories I could tell you about the exciting childhood of one of my sons. Actually, it was kind of fun, especially now that it's over. And he has a son that's just like him, so you get a little payback. But Peter, and this is the part that we need to see. Okay, so we know, of course, that Peter is going to deny Jesus, and it's almost unthinkable that he would do so. But it's also nice to know that God had chosen Peter. And of course, he knew Peter through and through. He knew Peter would deny Jesus, and yet he chose him and raised him up and nurtured him to be a disciple. And that should give us encouragement, because it doesn't matter what type of personality we are, settled or not. I tend oftentimes to say things before I think, and can be a little loud, but that makes me not afraid to teach either. But God knows, no matter what kind of person we are, he will use us, and he loves us from the very beginning. So whenever you think about Peter, he was very brave. He loved Jesus fully, and we can admire and learn from him. Also, another thing is God's never surprised by anything we do. He knew all about Peter again. So they're going to go to a place called Gethsemane, and we find out from the other scriptures in the other gospels that Jesus and his disciples were in the habit of going to this garden. Jerusalem did not have gardens because the area in which the city was built was very small. It was contained, and there wasn't room for gardens. So many of the richer people would go outside of Jerusalem, and they would create gardens for themselves where they would go to rest and repose and enjoy the rural countryside. So apparently Jesus had some rich friends that allowed him to use their garden, and he would often go there and pray. And I think just by the fact that everyone knew that by habit he went to Gethsemane to pray, that his prayer life was incredible. Of course, we've seen throughout the gospel where he seems to constantly be going to his father and hearing what his father is saying. So it's no surprise that He had a very intense and regular prayer life with his Father, and some of it would happen here in the Garden of Gethsemane. I think the Garden of Gethsemane is one of the hardest parts of the Gospel of Mark to teach. And it is because I feel there's so much there, and Jesus shows us his humanity in a way that we rarely see anyone. He shows his anxiety, and to be honest, I think he felt terror at what was coming up. It's also the place where really our salvation was wrought. Not so much by the time he was on the cross, he had already made the decision here in the garden to die for us and to trust God that whatever was coming, that he could trust God to bring it to a good end. So if you think about it, this is really where Jesus makes the decision and is obedient to his Father to go ahead with the next few hours where he is led away and is like a sheep to slaughter and was hung on a cross. I don't think there's anything in the whole gamut of physical pain and mental torture that Jesus did not experience. And a lot of it happened here in the garden. God the Father had a plan of salvation, but Jesus the man had to do his part by accepting to do it and trusting that the Father would bring it about to his and the world's good. So this is all that's happening in the garden. Verse 32, he went to the place called Gethsemane and said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. So he left most of the disciples there at the entrance of the garden. And then he took Peter, James, and John a little further in because he wanted them within sight. Jesus wanted two things while being here in the garden during this time before he was to die, and fellowship with his Father. Of course, he went to pray, but also he wanted fellowship with his friends. And so he brought the three with him and didn't go very far away. They were still within eyesight, and he began to pray. In the Greek, what he tells the three disciples to pray, he goes, stay here and keep watch, the three of them. And he said, my soul is overwhelmed even unto death. And I believe the mental and emotional turmoil and pain he went through was almost to the point of death. And he told the three, in Greek, it says, pray that you will not enter the place of testing where it is so severe that it will lead you to solicit an answer to do what is evil, under which you will fall. So we hear, in scripture it says, and pray that you will not be tempted. But this is the severity and the depth of what he is asking them to pray. One of the ladies brought up that it's a good reminder to us during the good times to pray that we will be able to stand up under any trial that could come our way or temptation, and the time to pray is before it happens. And if you pray that way, then when it does happen, it's a little easier to go through. And don't forget the Lord's Prayer, where he taught the disciples and us how to pray. He does say, pray, do not lead us in temptation, but deliver us from evil. And evil is anything that is not God's idea or his way to do things. So evil comes from people too. Of course, Satan has his hand in all of it too, but we are reminded to pray that we too are not tempted beyond our strength to resist. Going a little further, verse 36, he fell to the ground and prayed, if it is possible, the hour might pass from him. Abba, Father, everything's possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. The cup represents to them anything that was going to happen to them, either in their life or in a season. So it was the cup of what life circumstances, what was going to happen. Also, the hour also does talk about the circumstances of also what's going to happen. I think I have that mixed up a little bit. The cup is the will of God for your life or a specific plan for it. So the cup was what God had planned for him, and the hour is the time frame in which it was going to happen. Not that it happened in an hour, but it's a metaphor for a season of time. Okay. In the garden, he faced death as a human, as a man, and he didn't want to die. He was at the prime of his life. He had a lot of life to give. He had a mission that he had started, and I'm sure that you can understand that to leave when you know you're not finished with what you're doing, and you worry that those that you've brought along will not be able to accomplish it. He had successfully resisted and defeated religion in the temptation in the wilderness, and part of the garden is him obeying God's will, even though he could see a way for himself to live a life where he could establish in a man's mind the kingdom of God and disciple people and show the world that way what it looks like. So don't ever pass over this garden time and not meditate and think about, this is a man. God was fully man. He knew what was coming because he knew the scriptures. He had an incredible relationship with the Father. And of course, he discerned that this had great purpose. I don't think as a man, he understood the depth and the width of his salvation, his redemption of the world. And one of the ladies had a problem with that. And I said, the thing with Jesus is that he's totally man, totally God. And as a man, he did not avail himself of anything that we can't avail ourselves of. Otherwise, his example would be as nothing to us, because we'd say, yeah, but he had that supernatural knowledge, or yeah, he had supernatural strength. But no, Jesus was fully a man, and he faced the death on the cross, which was physically horrendous and horrible. He knew what this was like, because the Romans were always crucifying people, and they'd put them up along the road so that people would see and be afraid of the Romans, because this is the punishment they would have. As well as Jesus discerning to a very great extent that this had such meaning spiritually. Um, and it was very horrible to contemplate. And this is why, when he was able, after 3 times of having such intense prayer, that even his capillaries in his skin burst and came to the surface of his skin and dropped like sweat. This is told in one of the other gospels. He was in such agony that this happened. Yet when he came to the end of it, he willingly and freely trusted his Father and said, Father, I don't know what's going to happen, and I know that it will cost a great price for me, but I trust that your will is so much greater than mine, and I obey and will trust you. And this is when he won the victory over death, the sin, the grave, the devil, and the evil lost their fight because he knew and trusted the Father and the Father's love for him. Also, it was during his garden time. This gospel doesn't talk about it, but talks about an angel came to strengthen him. So he had that. And in fact, we'll talk a little bit about angels in a few minutes when we come to the part where the young man flees without clothes from the garden. We oftentimes have our own kind of Garden of Gethsemane times where we see the future and we realize it's going to cost us, and we're not sure that it's going to be worth it. And sometimes this can be in the area of our relationships, either with our spouse or with our family. It can be in the way of our vocation, and wondering what we should do. Even if it's not a religious vocation, we all want to do what God wants us to do, and sometimes it is hard for us to follow that route. Even becoming a mother, so when you realize the extent of sacrifice and heartache it will bring, you have to be fully committed to that, and sometimes we struggle. Also spiritual struggles, and I think sometimes we can see with our natural eyes things that do have benefit and would make our life easier and would make it more comfortable. If we maybe deny the spiritual trust and faith to walk out our life, and these can be our gardens, and God will strengthen us and give us insight. But most of all, I think in these times we'll feel the love of God. And if we remember all the things that God has brought us through, and to renew our very commitment to the Lord, why we walk with the Lord and all that he does for us. So that's how we can handle some of our intense struggles. Also knowing that Jesus went through them and we can trust him. He knows what we go through. I don't think there's anything he went through, and the garden really took care of that in so many ways, because just before, he lost his friends. Of course, his whole life he'd had people, his people did not believe in him. He had people constantly fighting him and questioning his integrity and his sanity. And then in the garden, he suffered separation from friends. And we see maybe even separation from angelic beings. And then on the cross, of course, Jesus did not sin. He was a man without sin. So he never experienced separation from God because of sin. But on the cross, he did the only time experience separation from God as he turned away, as the payment for our sin was paid. And so he understands even that, and how much greater it must have been for him, because his relationship with his Father had been always, always so close and intimate, and his presence had always been with him. So we never have to doubt that Jesus does not understand everything we go through. If we have mental health issues or physical health issues, that chronic health issues, or even if we struggle with the way we're made, or maybe our body image, or that we're not able to do the things that we would really like to do. I know sometimes I kiddingly say this, I always wanted to be a scholar, but God did not give me that kind of brain. So um, uh, you have to just know that Jesus knows what's best, and he knows what it feels like. So we are perfectly comforted and saved and nurtured and loved in the hand of the Father. Then when he returned to the disciples after praying 3 times, they were asleep. And he kind of ironically said, "Oh, you need to rest? Well, rest." But then he said, um, "Enough. The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." So it's dark. The garden doesn't have a lot of light in it. Judas had made the agreement that since it was dark, the authorities might have had a hard time recognizing which one was Jesus. So Judas had said, "He will be the one I greet or kiss," because, in that culture, when you greeted a person of your own honor status, you would kiss them on both cheeks. So Judas is coming. Now, this is where I wish I was a scholar and could articulate the things that I read and actually retain it longer than I usually do. But one thing about Jesus is, up until the point of his arrest, he had been dictating his life. He'd been in charge. He was the subject of his life. He decided where he was going, of course, with the Father. He decided healing, when he would do a miracle, his teaching, who he ministered to, who he spoke to, and how he lived. But at his arrest, Jesus becomes the object of other people's actions. And those other people's actions are, of course, man. And man is showing his deepest, truest evil side by taking this good, holy man, whom many of them did suspect he was the Messiah, and take him and kill him. So this is one time where the will of God goes alongside with the will of people in order to show, and Jesus to surrender himself, to sacrifice himself for these very people that killed him. So, of course, once he decided that's what he would do, he got up. Now, you'll notice that the Father never answered him directly. I don't know if you've ever had times in prayer like that. I can think of times where I prayed for an answer or what I should do, and there wasn't a direct answer or not a real certainty. And yet I knew that the Father would be with me, and direct me as I went. And Jesus, in this instant, didn't get a direct answer from the Father, but he knew he could trust the Father. And so his answer, the Father's answer, it's called the language of facts, are the things that happened to Jesus. That was God's answer to the things that Jesus prayed. And just as he was speaking, wake up, you guys, Judas, one of the 12, appeared. With him was a crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the scribes. So this is a bunch of people from the Sanhedrin. Pharisees, Sadducees, scribes, teachers of the law, priests, and also probably some hanger-oners that saw this group of Jewish authorities as well as the Roman soldiers going in mass towards the garden. And so there were probably a lot of hanger-oners, mob-type people that followed and wanted to see what was going to happen. And the Romans expected a fight, so they came armed. Now, the one I kiss, arrest him and lead him away. In the Greek, in verse 44, where it says, the one I kiss is the man. The word kiss there is simply a kiss. But the word that describes going at once to Jesus, Judas said, Rabbi, and kissed him. The kiss that Judas gives him was not just a little peck on the cheek or the kiss of greeting, but it is related to the kind of kiss that two lovers give one another. And it sort of conveys the idea that Judas here was convinced that what he was doing was the best thing for Jesus. And it's sort of like spouses, when one has an affair and leaves the spouse, thinks that, oh, this will be the best thing for them too, and I'm going, and gives a great kiss of farewell or whatever. But this is what was happening with Judas. It was very intimate and had a lot of feeling on the part of Judas. So Judas was not mentioned again in Mark, and you can go to the other Gospels and see what happened to Judas and some of the circumstances. But Judas did return the 30 pieces of silver, threw them back. They would not receive it because that was unlawful. It was unclean. So they debated, what should we do with this money? And they decided to buy a potter's field. And that's a field where unconsecrated or unclean, i.e. foreigners, would be buried. So and then he went out and hung himself. Now, one of the other Gospels said that I believe that he fell and spilled out. One of the early church fathers, and these are men that lived close to in the first and second century, but especially in the first century, they were the disciples of the disciples. So they would know, some of them knew John. John lived to be an old man, and many of them knew John, so had heard all this and were discipled by him. And then they would disciple others, and those are the church fathers. So one church father gives this explanation that Judas survived his hanging. It didn't happen, but as he grew older, he became very diseased and putrid, that there were things going on inside. Probably, it sounds like a rancid infection. It's really gross terms. And that people would not go near him or where he lived because it smelled so bad. And that one day as he was walking, he simply fell down and split open. So that's the way a church father reconciles those two memories of the disciples. The men seized Jesus and arrested him. Now one of those standing near him drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Now when Peter wrote this, because Peter's dictating to Mark, he could not still in safety at the time he dictated this say that it was him that was the one that cut the ear off, because he was still in danger of being arrested. He just didn't want any of the authorities to know, because Lord knows the early Christians were always in trouble for everything, and didn't want to give the authorities any excuse to arrest them. But later, John, who writes about 30, 40 years later, all this is past. Peter's been dead for a while, and John mentions that it was Peter that cut the ear off, and also mentions that Jesus, like he does here, says, no, this isn't what we're doing. And he takes the ear and touches the servant and he heals it. So I think I'll leave the status degradation ritual description till next time. And it's an actual process that Jews came up with to dishonor a man. And it's also a process that the Romans did in order to dishonor and disgrace a criminal. So we'll talk a little bit about this next time when we come to the trials and the scourging and him carrying the cross to the, or needing help to carry the cross to where he was crucified. Jesus says, am I leading a rebellion that you come out with swords and clubs to capture me? And that is a way of shaming the authorities, the Jewish authorities. Anytime in the Jewish society, if you resorted to violence, it was shameful. It was dishonorable. So Jesus is kind of sticking it to him there. And he goes, every day I was with you teaching in the temple courts, and you didn't arrest me, but the scriptures must be fulfilled. So the authorities showed great deal of cowardness to arrest Jesus in this way. Of course, they had hoped to secretly kidnap him and kill him, but they didn't want to do it during Passover because there were too many people. But then Judas came and presented this opportunity that he would help them arrest Jesus, so they took it. It's kind of fun because Jesus refers to them as bandits, and this is the same word that the Pharisees had used against him, and he had used about the temple being the cave of robbers. Now, the bandits they're talking about in first century Palestine, even during King Herod, great King Herod, who was already dead by this time, he was the father of Herod, who's now with his brothers ruling Palestine. Things were so bad, and the common people were being thrown off their land either by being so much in debt. It's sort of like the coal miners, that the only place they could buy anything was at the company store, and the store would charge outrageous prices so that the coal miners were always in debt. And this ensured that they would continue to work at what was a pretty much inhumane, horrible job. Well, in Palestine, taxes would be so high that the common person would have to borrow in order to pay it. And of course, because they took so much of their produce, they could never pay it back. And so they would be thrown off their land. And when this happened to a very large extent as it was, then there would be these groups of bandits that would rob the rich, i.e. the elites, and take it and share it with the poor. In fact, this happens so much in these kind of agrarian societies where there's such an imbalance there that the historians say that these legends or stories like Robin Hood are based on fact, because that's exactly what would happen. And these are the kind of bandits, they're called social bandits, that they have been talking about, and the elites hated them. And they would often have, the Good Samaritan, he'd probably been robbed by such bandits. And especially on that road to Jericho around Jerusalem, there were a lot of hills and there were a lot of caves that were very difficult to get to. And the bandits would hide out there with their families, probably having some kind of rope ladder that would get them in and out. And King Herod, who was, remember, we talked about this first or second chapter, he was not a kind man. And as he got older and a little sick, he became more and more cruel. In fact, one of the leaders in Rome, one of the Caesars, said, it's better to be Herod's pig than to be a son, because Herod ended up killing many of his sons and even killed a wife that he had deeply loved. And of course, as a practicing Jew, he would have never killed a pig. So anyway, Herod, this guy, he's real bad. He devised this way that he got his strongest soldiers and he put them in baskets, which would be lowered down to these caves. And the soldiers would then go in and take all the people in the cave and throw them off the cliff, which would be how they would kill all the bandits and their families and their children. And even when these robbers, social robbers, were given the chance to surrender, they never would, because the tax situation and the injustice of the society was so great. So there had been a lot of those bandits during the time of King Herod, and there was kind of a lull in that intensity during the lifetime of Jesus, just because of what was going on culturally. And then not soon after, in the probably 40s and 50s, before 65 AD, when there was a great revolt against Rome, there again was a lot of this social bandit activity. So Jesus is kind of playing it back on them and saying, what, coming like this, da, da. So then everyone, verse 50, everyone deserted him and fled. Verse 51 and 52, this is two of the funnest verses here. A young man wearing nothing but a linen garment was following Jesus. When they seized him, he fled naked, leaving his garment behind. So he basically ran out of the garden in his little boxers shorts and was naked. Now, I had kind of heard that since this story is only told in Mark, that this was probably Mark as a teenager, because he was a young man, too young to be a disciple, but he hung around the disciples a lot. In fact, his mother became a very strong Christian, and in her home in Jerusalem was where one of the home churches was. So some people have said, well, since Mark reported this, maybe it was him. because he would, of course, stake out and watch everything. But then I read another thing that I think is pretty interesting, is said that the only creatures or people that would wear just one garment because they didn't need the extra protection of like a coat or other layers were angelic beings. So they pondered, well, maybe this was the angel that came to minister to Jesus. And he even ran away, which would add to the fact that Jesus was quite abandoned by all of his friends. So anyway, it's a fun thing to think about. It could have been Mark or an angel. Okay, so they took Jesus to the high priest, and the elders and the teachers of the law came together. So this is the Sanhedrin, and this is the council of all the authorities. I think there were 71. Now, I believe this was Caiaphas. No, yeah, Caiaphas is the first one. Mark doesn't go through all the trials like the other ones, and the next chapter will talk a little bit more in depth about it. But they went to Caiaphas, who had been the previous. I may have Annas and Caiaphas mixed up. That they were related to each other by marriage. One of them had married the other's daughter and was the high priest at that time. So I believe it was Caiaphas. No, Annas, I think. They'd been a previous high priest and still were, ruling behind the throne kind of thing. And this was right after they arrested Jesus. So this is at night. And this hearing was only to fatally and irreversibly undermine the honor and social standing of Jesus. That's its only purpose. The hearing was the elites just getting together to decide among themselves. There were no guidelines to this meeting, and it was the only thing that they ruled by were the desires and the whims of the elites that were there. Now, this was very common. This was the normal way that these so-called trials were done. It's not like our legal system where there's rules. But at this point, it's even worse because they're breaking all of their rules in order to have it. Some of the rules they broke were they could not meet at night. And of course, this is nighttime. It's getting to be middle of the night. They cannot, the group cannot, as a group, give a verdict, but every individual within the group gives a verdict. And there's no indication that this happened at all. And if they made the decision that the person was worthy of death, then a whole day and night had, well, in this case, because they wouldn't be meeting at night, but a whole night had to pass before they could make or carry out that decision. And of course, we see that Jesus was arrested and had these so-called trials, and by early morning, he was before Herod and was being flogged. So Peter follows in a distance, verses 55 to 60. At this so-called trial, they kept trying to find somebody that would testify falsely against Jesus. But what happened is every time they found a person that had any interactions with Jesus, they'd say, well, yeah, I know that man. I was lame and he healed me. Or, yes, I know that man. I was blind and he gave me sight. Or, I know that man. I had leprosy and he cleansed me. So they couldn't find anybody that would rat him out until finally somebody said, well, I heard him say that he would destroy the temple, and then in 3 days would build another one, not made with hands. But of course, Jesus never said, I will destroy the temple. He said, in fact, this temple will be destroyed completely. Just as a side note here, I don't know if I mentioned it before, but the reason it was true that in 70 AD, the temple was destroyed, and it was after that horrific siege of Jerusalem that was one of the cruelest events of all history. And the temple was completely torn down because the soldiers, there had been a rumor among them that the Jews had hid gold in between the bricks. And so they destroyed the entire temple except for the one temple wall that's still there and people pray at in Jerusalem. So not even their testimony could agree. Then the high priest stood up before them and asked Jesus, are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? Now, the high priest cannot ask that kind of leading question and ask a question that will convict the criminal. So that too was illegal for them to do. But Jesus remained silent and said, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? I am, said Jesus, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Now, Jesus said this because it was true, but also so they could never say, well, we tried him and he didn't have a word to say for himself. And also to at least tell the truth once at this. And of course, the high priest considered this blasphemy and tore their clothes and said, we don't need any more witnesses. You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? And they all condemned him as worthy of death. And some spit at him and blindfolded him and struck him and said, prophesy. And the guards took him and beat him. Okay, Mark kind of squishes in the 3 different trials and then the time before Herod, and we'll get to Herod in the next chapter. But this tearing of the clothes shows that there has been a great break between the boundary of God's holiness and uncleanness. And it also is a sign of mourning because there's a tear in the social fabric when someone dies. And it also shows that they consider him worthy. He was so evil, he was worthy of death. Now, this public abasement before the Judean people in the temple, sort of the first trial, actually it can be the second one because he went to 2 high priests. It was only done to attempt to get Jesus completely dishonored and dishonored from the beginning so that people would see that he was not the man that he said he was. And we're going to hear more about this in the next chapter and the way that they would go about this. Now, Peter in 66 to 70 again was in a courtyard, and the servant girls of the high priest came by and saw Peter and said, oh, I recognize you. And he denied it again. And he goes, I don't understand what you're talking about. And he went out to the entryway. And then when the servant saw him there, she began to say, wait, this fellow is one of them. In the other Gospels, it talks about, you can tell he's a Galilean. Of course, it was by his accent. Now, after a while, those standing near to Peter said, surely you're one of them. You're a Galilean. And he began to call down curses on them, not on Jesus, and swore to them, I don't know this man you're talking about. Immediately, the rooster crowed the second time. Then Jesus remembered the word Jesus had spoken to him. Then Peter remembered the words Jesus spoke to him. Before the rooster crows twice, you will disown me 3 times. And he broke down and he wept. This is the end of the chapter. Another thing about the rooster crowing is there would be the real roosters would crow, and then they'd crow real loud at dawn. It was considered a second time. But also the Romans divided the night into 4 watches of 3 hours. And at the end of the third watch, which was about 3 a.m., they blew a bugle, and its name in Latin was the cock crow. So very possibly he also heard the bugle that was considered the cock crowing in the morning. So that is chapter 15 or 14. Sorry, I get them mixed up because I'm studying all the different chapters. And again, I do not have a scholar's mind. So I'd ask that as we go into the next 2 chapters, so it must be 14, 15, and 16, that where we deal, just to be in prayer that God will extend his mercy and help us to understand even to a deeper degree all that Jesus went through in order to attain our salvation. So the Lord bless you. I pray he will greatly open your eyes when you read scripture, and that the things you learn will help you to love and to know Jesus in a deeper way. And also in learning and understanding the disciples, you will learn about yourself. And in that, as the disciples were so greatly beloved by God and by Jesus, no matter what they did, even Judas was loved by Jesus, that you too will feel how much that the Lord loves you. So thank you.